The Jardin du Luxembourg, or the Luxembourg Garden, located in the 6th arrondissement of Paris, was created beginning in 1612 by Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France. For a new residence she constructed the Luxembourg Palace. The garden today is owned by the French Senate, which meets in the palace. It covers 23 hectares and is known for its lawns, tree-lined promenades, flower beds, the model sailboats on its circular basin, and for the picturesque Medici Fountain, built in 1620. History. In 1611, Marie de Medici, the widow of Henry IV and the regent for the King Louis XIII, decided to build a palace in imitation of the Pitti Palace in her native Florence. She purchased the Hôtel du Luxembourg and began construction of the new palace. She commissioned Salomon de Brosset to build the palace and a fountain, which still exists. In 1612 she planted 2,000 elm trees, and erected a series of gardeners, most notably Tommaso Francini, to build a park in the style she had known as a child in Florence. Francini planned 2 terraces with balustrades and parterres laid out along the axis of the chateau, lined around a circular basin. He also built the Medici Fountain to the east of the palace as a nymphaeum, an artificial grotto and fountain, without its present pond and statuary. The original garden was just 8 hectares in size. In 1630 she bought additional land and enlarged the garden to 30 hectares, and entrusted the work to Jacques Boisseau de la Bourodierie, the intendant of the Royal Gardens of Tuileries and the early Garden of Versailles. He was one of the early theorists of the new and more formal Garden à la Française, and he laid out a series of squares along an east-west alley closed at the east end by the Medici Fountain, and a rectangle of parterres with broderies of flowers and hedges in front of the palace. In the center he placed an octagonal basin with the fountain, with a perspective toward what is now the Paris Observatory. Later monarchs largely neglected the garden. In 1780, the Comte de Provence, the future Louis XVIII, sold the eastern part of the garden for real estate development. Following the French Revolution, however, the leaders of the French Directory expanded the garden to 40 hectares by confiscating the land of the neighboring religious order of the Carthusian monks. The architect Jean Chalgrin, the architect of the Arc de Triomphe, took on the task of restoring the garden. He remade the Medici Fountain and laid out a long perspective from the palace to the observatory. He preserved the famous pépinière or nursery garden of the Carthusian order, and the old vineyards, and kept the garden in a formal French style. During and after the July monarchy of 1848, the park became the home of a large population of statues, first the queens and famous women of France, lined along the terraces, then, in 1880s and 1890s, monuments to writers and artists. A small-scale model by Bartholdi of his Statue of Liberty and one modern sculpture by Zadkine. In 1865, during the reconstruction of Paris by Louis Napoleon, the Rue de l'Abbaye de l'Epeque was extended into the park, cutting off about 7 hectares, including a large part of the old nursery garden. The building of new streets next to the park also required moving and rebuilding the Medici Fountain to its present location. The long basin of the fountain was added at this time, along with the statues at the foot of the fountain. During this reconstruction, the director of Parks and Promenades of Paris, Gabriel de Vieude, built new ornamental gates and fences around the park, and polychrome brick garden houses. He also transformed what remained of the old Chartres nursery garden at the south end of the park into an English garden with winding paths, and planted a fruit garden in the southwest corner. He kept the regular geometric pattern of the paths and alleys, but did create one diagonal alley near the Medici Fountain which opened a view of the Pantheon. The garden in the late 19th century contained a marionette cabaret theatre, a music kiosk, greenhouses, an apiary, a beehouse, an orangery also used for displaying sculpture and modern art, a rose garden, the fruit orchard, and about 70 works of sculpture. Features: the garden is largely devoted to a green parterre of gravel and lawn populated with statues and centered on a large octagonal basin of water, with a central jet of water. In it children sail model boats. The garden is famed for its calm atmosphere. Surrounding the basin on the raised balustraded terraces are a series of statues of former French queens, saints and copies after the antique. In the southwest corner, there is an orchard of apple and pear trees and the Tête des Marionnettes. The gardens include a large fenced-in playground for young children and the parents and a vintage carousel. In addition, free musical performances are presented in a gazebo on the grounds, and there is a small cafe-restaurant nearby under the trees, with both indoor and outdoor seating from which many people enjoy the music over a glass of wine. The orangery displays art, photography and sculptures. The École Nationale Supérieure des Mines de Paris and the Ode Couteau and Theatre stand next to the Luxembourg Garden. The central axis of the garden is extended, beyond its wrought iron grille and gates opening to Rue Auguste Comte, by the central esplanade of the Rue de l'Observatoire, officially the Jardin Marco Polo, where sculptures of the 4 times of day alternate with columns and culminate at the southern end with the 1874 fountain of the observatory, also known as the Fontaine des Quatre Parties du Monde, or the Carpeaux Fountain, for its sculptures by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. It was installed as part of the development of the Avenue de l'Observatoire by Gabriel de Vieude in 1867. The bronze fountain represents the work of 4 sculptors. Louis Vuillemot carved the garlands and festoons around the pedestal. Pierre Legrain carved the armillary with interior globe and zodiac band. The animalier Emmanuel Fremiet designed the 8 horses, marine turtles and spouting fish. Most importantly, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux sculpted the 4 nude women supporting the globe, representing the 4 continents of classical iconography. Open hours for the Luxembourg Garden depend on the month, opening between 7:30 and 8:15 a.m., closing at dusk between 4:45 and 9:45 p.m. Statuary. The garden contains just over 100 statues, monuments, and fountains, scattered throughout the grounds. Surrounding the central green space are 20 figures of French queens and illustrious women standing on pedestals. They were commissioned by Louis Philippe in 1848 and include Anne of Austria, Anne of Brittany, Anne of France, Anne Marie-Louise of Orléans, Bertha of Burgundy, Blanche of Castile, Clémence Isère, Jean III of Navarre, Laure de Noves, Louise of Savoy, Margaret of Anjou, Margaret of Provence, Marguerite of Navarre, Marie de Medici, Mary, Queen of Scots, Matilda, Duchess of Normandy, Saint Bathilde, Saint Clotilde, Saint Genevieve, and Valentina Visconti. Other sculpted work includes Pierre-Guillaume Frédéric Leclerc by André-Joseph Allard, 1906. Statue of Liberty, first model, by Frédéric Bartholdi, 1870. La Bocca della Verita, by Jules Blanchard. Ludwig van Beethoven, by Antoine Bourdelle, placed here 1978. Monument for Henry Murger, by Théophile Henry Bouillon, 1895. Multiple animal sculptures by Auguste Gain. Le Triomphe de Céline, 1885. Homage to Delacroix, 1890. A monument to Auguste Schurey-Kestner, 1908, both by Jules Delou. Monument to Jean-Antoine Watteau, by Henry Désiré Gorkia, 1896. Narcissus, 1869, and Arionysis sur un Dauphin, 1870, both by Ernest Eugene Hayol. Hippomenes by Jean-Antoine Injalbert. Bust of Charles Baudelaire, by Pierre-Félix Massot. Polyphemus surprising Acis and Galatea de Fontaine Medicis by Auguste Otten, 1866. Clément Césarée by Antoine Augustin Préau. Theseus and the Minotaur by Etienne Jules Rémy, 1826. Hercules diverting the river Alpheus, 1900, and Lefit, 1902, both by Pierre Roche. Paul Verlaine by Rodot, 1911. Monument to Edouard Branly by Charles-Marie Louis Joseph Sarah Bezols. Georges Sand by François-Élie Couteau-Ensicard, 1904. Jules Massenet by Raoul Vellet, 1926. Martial Net by François Rude and Alphonse de Gisors, 1853. Medici Fountain. The Medici Fountain was built in 1630 by Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France and regent of King Louis XIII of France. It was designed by Tommaso Floncini, a Florentine fountain maker and hydraulic engineer who was brought from Florence to France by King Henry IV. It was in the form of a grotto, a popular feature of the Italian Renaissance garden. It fell into ruins during the 18th century, but in 1811, at the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, the fountain was restored by Jean Chalgrin, the architect of the Arc de Triomphe. In 1864–66, the fountain was moved to its present location, centered on the east front of the Palais-du Luxembourg. The long basin of water was built and flanked by plane trees, and the sculptures of the giant Polyphemus surprising the lovers Acis and Galatea, by French classical sculptor Auguste Otten, were added to the grotto's rockwork. Hidden behind the Medici Fountain is the Fontaine d'Arrêt, a wall fountain built during the time of Napoleon Bonaparte at the corner of the Rue du Regard and Rue de Voiron, with a bas-relief sculpture depicting the legend of Leda and the Swan by Achille Valois. When the original site was destroyed during the prolongation of the Rue de Rennes in 1856 by Louis Napoleon, the fountain was preserved and moved in 1866 to the Luxembourg Gardens and attached to the back of the Medici Fountain. Jardin du Luxembourg in popular culture. The gardens are featured prominently in Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. It is here that the principal love story of the novel unfolds, as the characters Marius Pontmercy and Cosette first meet. Henry James also uses the gardens in The Ambassadors as the place where his character Lambert Strether has an epiphany about his identity. The final scene of William Faulkner's novel Sanctuary is set in the gardens. Patrick Modiano heard the news he had won the 2014 Nobel Prize in Literature via a mobile phone call from his daughter while walking through Paris, just next to the Jardin du Luxembourg. Non-literary references include as the setting for a few episodes of French in Action, the cover of Tame Impala's 2012 album Lonerism, the title of a song by the band The Ghost of a Saber-Toothed Tiger, and the Gardens and Palace being added as a mission in the video game Assassin's Creed Unity. Images. Bibliography. André Arnold Peltier and Vassili Karist. Le Jardin du Luxembourg, The Luxembourg Gardens. Editions Pippa. Collection Itinérances. Paris et ses Fontaines, de la Renaissance à nos jours. Texts assembled by Dominique Massouni, Pauline Prévost, Marcella C. and Daniel Rabreau. Délégation à l'action artistique de la Ville de Paris. From the collection Paris et son patrimoine. Directed by Beatrice de Andia. Paris, 1995. Dominique Jarosset, Grammaire des Jardins Parisiens, Paragram, Paris, 2007.